On the night of April 14th, 1912, Titanic moved through the dark Atlantic exactly as her builders intended, warm, orderly, and utterly certain of herself. Nothing yet asked her passengers to think of the sea at all. If this evening of clinking glasses and warm light feels like your kind of place, leave a comment with the dish from an old menu you'd most want to taste again, and consider liking or subscribing for more restful history. Inside the first-class dining saloon, dinner had settled into its rhythm, a surviving menu from that very evening, still kept today among museum collections, lists a meal built in the old formal style. Oysters to begin, then a clear soup named for a duchess, cream of barley, poached salmon dressed in a pale mousseline sauce, and filet mignon served under its own delicate name, as though the kitchen wanted each course to feel like a small announcement. Chicken sautéed in the French manner followed, and then a procession of sweets that would have taken the better part of an hour on their own. It was a menu built for people who expected the evening to unfold slowly, in stages, with nothing more urgent than the next course arriving at the correct moment. The dishes themselves tell us something about the mood of the room. This was not a hurried meal, nor a modest one. It was food composed to be admired as much as eaten, brought out under silver covers by waiters trained to make the process look effortless. Later recollections describe the room glowing with fresh flowers on the tables, small baskets of fruit set out for effect, and women in new gowns brought especially for the crossing, the kind of dresses meant to be seen rather than merely worn. Those details come from a passenger account recorded well after the voyage, so we should hold them a little more loosely than the surviving menu itself, but they fit naturally with what such an evening would have looked like. Together they suggest a room organized around comfort, display, and the pleasant predictability of Edwardian high society afloat. It helps to picture the practical rhythm beneath all that polish. Waiters would have moved between tables in a set pattern, refilling glasses, clearing plates in careful sequence, never crossing paths, never drawing attention to themselves. Diners would have leaned toward one another between courses, exchanging the sort of comment one makes about weather, or crossings past, or family waiting at the far end of the Atlantic. It was, by every reasonable reconstruction, a night of small talk rather than serious talk, the kind of evening where conversation drifted easily because nothing pressed against it. Second-class passengers, dining in their own saloon at the same hour, have left us far less direct evidence of their exact table settings or their particular words that night. But the broader pattern of the ship's operation makes it reasonable to picture their evening as a smaller mirror of the first-class routine, a proper multi-course dinner, less ornate, still served with real attention, in a room designed to feel respectable rather than opulent. If the first-class saloon was a stage for visible luxury, the second-class dining room was more likely a stage for quiet respectability, a chance for families of modest means to feel, for one crossing, properly looked after. Outside both dining rooms, the ship's public spaces carried on with their own kind of order. Passengers leaving dinner would have paused to collect coats and wraps before stepping onto the promenade decks, since even a calm April night in the North Atlantic carried a real, immediate cold. Stewards stationed near cloakrooms and stairwells would have handled that exchange the way they handled everything else that evening, smoothly and without comment, the sort of small service so well executed it barely registers as service at all. We can picture this with confidence, even without a name attached to any particular steward or passenger, because it reflects standard practice on ocean liners of this class and period, rather than a specific claim about who did what. Music likely drifted through some of these transitions as well. Ships of Titanic standing typically employed small ensembles to play during and after dinner in select public rooms, easing passengers from the dining saloon into the lounges, smoking rooms, and reception areas where the evening would continue. There is no documented set list for this particular hour, so it is best understood as part of the ship's general atmosphere rather than a confirmed event of that night. Still, some music, some murmur of conversation, some clink of coffee cups in the reception room fits comfortably within what we know of the vessel's habits. What stands out most, stepping back from these small pieces, is the contrast between the brightness inside and the blankness outside. Every porthole and saloon window held back a night that was, by nearly every surviving account, unusually still and cold, with a calm sea and a sky slowly filling with stars. Inside, warmth, noise, silver, and flowers. Outside, an ocean indifferent to all of it. That contrast was not remarkable to anyone aboard at the time. It was simply the ordinary shape of a well-run crossing, the kind of night meant to be forgotten precisely because it went so smoothly. For the passengers finishing their desserts, checking pocket watches, or gathering wraps for a short walk before retiring, there was no reason to think this particular evening deserved special notice. At least one traveler would keep that night's menu as a pleasant memento of an enjoyable meal, the sort of paper tucked into a pocket without ceremony. No one dining that evening could have known how significant such an ordinary souvenir would later become, or how closely it would one day be studied for clues about the last untroubled hours aboard the ship. By the time the dining saloons began to empty into lounges, smoking rooms, and quiet corners of the deck, Titanic still felt exactly like what she was built to be, a floating hotel of considerable comfort, moving steadily westward under full but unremarkable operation. There was still no hint in any account we have of anything unusual in the ship's motion or mood. The routine held, the luxury held. The night, for now, remained entirely ordinary. But even as the last plates were cleared from those tables, another shift of the ship's life was only just beginning below and behind the public rooms, in pantries, corridors, and narrow stairways, where a different kind of labor kept the whole bright evening running. Beneath the polished calm of the first-class dining saloon, another rhythm was already running, one the diners upstairs would never see and rarely think about. If the public rooms were the ship's face, turned outward and smiling, then the pantries and service corridors were her working hands, and those hands did not stop moving simply because the last course had been served. A dining room steward on Titanic, a man named William Burke, who later described his duties under oath, explained that his work did not begin when the doors opened for dinner and end when the last plate was cleared. He was on duty through all 3 main meals of the day, and for roughly an hour before and after each one as well. That detail alone reshapes how we should picture the evening. The elegant service that guests experienced as effortless, glasses appearing full, courses arriving in sequence, crumbs vanishing from tablecloths almost before anyone noticed them, was in fact the visible tip of a much longer working day. Long before the first diner sat down that evening, stewards like Burke were already moving through the saloon, checking settings, confirming supplies, making certain that nothing would interrupt the illusion of seamlessness once the room filled with voices and light. Burke identified himself specifically as a first-class dining room steward, which matters because it tells us something about how finely the ship's labor was divided. Titanic did not simply employ waiters in some general sense. Her service staff were organized by class, by room, and by function, each person assigned to a narrow set of responsibilities within a much larger machine. A steward serving first class would have had different tables, different expectations, and quite possibly a different rhythm of work than a steward serving second or third class elsewhere in the ship. This kind of specialization is easy to overlook from the passenger's side of the room, where the whole operation simply looked like attentive service. From the crew's side, it looked like a structure, almost like a small society with its own ranks, routines, and unspoken rules about who did what and when. Behind the stewards, and almost entirely unseen by any passenger, stood the pantry staff, One of them, a third-class pantryman named Albert Piercy, later testified in terms that are strikingly direct. His business, he said, was entirely in the pantry. He stated plainly that he had no duty in connection with the passengers at all. It is a small statement, but it draws a firm line through the ship's invisible geography. On one side of that line stood the men whose job was to be seen, to smile, to carry plates past watching eyes, to make service look like hospitality rather than labor. On the other side stood men like Piercy, whose entire working world was corridors, sinks, shelving, and doorways that passengers were never meant to notice, let alone enter. It is worth pausing on what that pantry world actually contained, because it explains how the dining rooms above could keep functioning smoothly for hours at a stretch. Later accounts describing the general duties of Titanic's service crew describe pantries as places stocked with crockery and tableware, and as spaces where food and drink were prepared for carrying out to the dining rooms proper. Pantrymen, by this same general account, were expected to keep stock levels steady so that a request from a table did not have to wait on a scramble to locate more bread, more butter, more clean glasses. If this description holds, and it fits comfortably with what we know of how large liners of the period organized their service, then the smooth flow guests experienced at dinner rested on a kind of constant, low-level anticipation happening just out of sight. Someone, always, was making sure the next request could be met the moment it was made. The same general accounts describe these service rooms as containing sinks, brushes, mops, and other tools for cleaning and upkeep, which suggests that pantry work was not only about preparation, but also about continuous resetting. Dishes came back dirty from the tables in a steady stream throughout the evening, not all at once at the end. They needed to be gathered, carried through narrow service passages, cleaned or set aside for cleaning, and their replacements sent back out in equally steady time. We should be cautious here, since these descriptions come from broader discussions of crew duties rather than direct sworn testimony about this specific evening, but they fit naturally with what practical experience tells us about running any large kitchen. The work of clearing and resetting a room for hundreds of diners does not happen in one dramatic push. It happens continuously, in 100 small motions, most of them invisible to the people being served. Picture, then, the corridors just behind the first-class dining saloon on this particular night. Corridors we know existed in general shape, even if no single witness described this precise hour of this particular evening in detail. Trays would have moved in one direction toward the tables and in the other direction back toward the pantry, a kind of tidal motion timed to the rise and fall of the meal itself. Stewards would have exchanged brief words with pantry staff, requests passed along in shorthand, more of this, less of that. Table 6 wants their coffee now. None of this needs embellishment to feel vivid, because the ordinary choreography of service work, multiplied across a ship carrying well over 2,000 people, is dramatic enough simply as a feat of coordination. It is also worth remembering that this labor was layered by class in more than one sense. The dining rooms in first, second, and third class did not simply differ in decoration, they differed in the systems of stewards and pantry staff supporting them, each system presumably calibrated to the number of passengers and the style of service expected. Third-class dining did not carry the same theatrical polish as first, but it still required food to be prepared, carried, and cleared in an orderly sequence, still required someone like Piercy to keep the shelves stocked and the pantry running so that meals could go out on schedule. The invisible labor changed in scale and perhaps in intensity from one class to another, but its basic shape, preparation, service, clearing, resupply, repeated itself throughout the ship. As the evening advanced and the last of the first-class diners drifted toward the lounges, smoking rooms, and promenades, the pantry work did not simply stop. Later calls were already being anticipated, a nightcap ordered from a lounge, a tray sent up to a stateroom, coffee for a group lingering past the main service hours. Burke's testimony about staying on duty roughly an hour after each meal suggests exactly this kind of extended tail to the evening, a period when the main rush had passed, but the machinery of service had not yet been allowed to rest. Somewhere in the pantry, tableware was being restocked for the next morning's breakfast, even as the night's last requests were still being answered. The ship's schedule ran forward continuously, meal into meal, day into day, and the people responsible for it had to think one shift ahead, even while finishing the one in front of them. None of this labor called attention to itself, and that, in its way, was the entire point. A passenger enjoying dessert or a late glass of wine was meant to feel that the evening simply happened around them, effortless and complete. The truth, visible only from the pantry side of the line Piercy described, was that this effortlessness was built minute by minute by people whose names would otherwise have gone unrecorded. It held steady this night as it had every night before, disciplined and largely unnoticed, even as another kind of information was beginning to arrive in a small, crowded room near the bridge, carried not on trays but on wires strung high above the water. That different kind of information arriving near the bridge was carried by wire and Morse code, not by tray or trolley, and it belonged to a room most passengers never saw and rarely thought about, the wireless cabin, tucked close to the bridge, humming with apparatus that connected Titanic, however imperfectly, to the wider ocean around her. From the outside, the ship might have looked like a self-contained kingdom of light and music, entirely sufficient to herself. In truth, she was one node in a loose chain of vessels crossing the same stretch of the North Atlantic that spring, all of them listening to each other through the same crude, temperamental technology, and all of them, in their own way, dependent on it. Wireless telegraphy in 1912 was still a young trade, closer to a specialized craft than a settled science. Messages arrived in Morse code, transcribed by hand, and had to be judged, sorted, and passed along by tired men working long shifts in a cramped space. Some of what came through that night was personal correspondence, passengers eager to send word ashore before the ship reached New York. Some was routine operational business, the ordinary traffic of a busy shipping lane, and mixed in among all of it were reports of ice, which several vessels working the crossing that season had begun to notice drifting further south than usual. Harold Bride, the junior wireless operator, later testified that among the ice-related messages reaching Titanic that day was one from the Californian, a steamer then making her own way westward through the same waters. According to his recollection, this message arrived in the afternoon, sometime around 5:30, and it reported 3 large icebergs near that ship's position. Bride said he acknowledged the message, confirming that it had been received aboard Titanic. This detail matters because it establishes something important for the rest of the evening. The ship was not sailing blind into the dark. Information about ice from another vessel nearby had already reached her wireless room hours before anything happened. But the record is not perfectly tidy, and honest history has to say so plainly. In some of his statements, Bride also suggested that this particular ice report may have been intended for Titanic without his fully registering at the moment it came through that it was directed to his own ship. He described becoming aware of its significance only somewhat after the fact, once there was reason to look back at it. This is not quite a contradiction so much as a glimpse into how wireless work actually functioned aboard a busy liner. Messages arrived as a stream, not as isolated alerts stamped with obvious importance. An operator listening for hours through headphones had to decide, almost continuously, what mattered now, what was routine, and what could wait until later. Under those working conditions, receiving a message and fully appreciating its consequence were not always the same event, separated sometimes by nothing more than the ordinary press of other duties. Later testimony, given before the United States Senate inquiry into the disaster, adds another piece to the picture. Bride described receiving a message and personally carrying it forward to the captain, which tells us that wireless traffic was not confined to the cabin itself, sealed away from the rest of the ship's command. Information gathered by the operators was, at least on some occasions, physically walked out of that small room and placed into the hands of the men responsible for Titanic's course and speed. This detail carries the story out of a purely technical space and into the more human territory of judgment and attention. Once a message reached an officer or the captain, its fate depended on how it was read against everything else demanding notice that evening, and how it compared in the moment with the ordinary hum of other traffic arriving at almost the same time. And there was a great deal of other traffic to compare it against. Surviving fragments of Marconi Company records compiled after the disaster describe a continuous run of messages sent and received aboard Titanic across the days leading into the night of the 14th, extending right up until the hour her distress signals began. This was not a single emergency channel switched on for one crisis. It was the everyday operation of a floating city's communication system, carrying condolences, greetings, small business notes, and, quietly mixed among them, scattered ice reports from other ships working the same crossing. Some of the material historians have examined since draws a distinction between different classes of message: ice warnings, official navigational business, and ordinary personal correspondence. That distinction supports a simple but essential point about the room itself. The wireless cabin was not a single-purpose alarm system standing ready for danger. It was a working office handling many kinds of information at once, of which ice was only one strand among several, however important that strand would later prove to be. It is tempting, looking back with the full weight of what happened afterward, to imagine every ice report glowing with unmistakable urgency the instant it arrived. But that certainty belongs to hindsight, and hindsight is not testimony. The men in that cabin and the officers who occasionally received word from it did not yet know they were living inside a story that would end the way this one did. They were living inside an ordinary night aboard an enormous, capably run ship, in which ice reports were simply one more category of information to log, acknowledge, and pass along amid dozens of other small tasks competing for the same limited attention. We should resist, too, the temptation to draw a single firm line connecting any particular message to any particular decision made that night. The historical record, pieced together from testimony given weeks and months afterward, under pressure, grief, and intense public scrutiny, does not offer a clean, minute-by-minute account of exactly which ice warnings were seen by which officer, or exactly how each one was weighed against the ship's speed and heading. What can be said with real confidence is this: ice warnings existed and were transmitted by other vessels working the same waters. At least one such warning from the Californian was received and acknowledged aboard Titanic, and this kind of information did move, at least on occasion, from the wireless room into the awareness of the ship's command. What cannot be said with the same confidence is how fully any single warning registered as urgent in the moment, or whether every report available that evening reached the people positioned to act on it while there was still time for it to matter. This uncertainty is not a failure of memory so much as an honest reflection of how information actually traveled aboard a ship of Titanic size and complexity. A warning received is not automatically a warning understood, and a warning understood is not automatically a warning acted upon with full seriousness. Between the antenna strung high above the deck and the mind of an officer standing his watch, there were many small human steps, each one capable of quietly dulling urgency without anyone intending harm or carelessness. So as the evening deepened, Titanic continued forward, brightly lit, her public rooms easing into their after-dinner rhythms, her wireless cabin steadily doing its patient work of passing signals into and out of the dark water around her. She was not isolated, whatever her outward appearance of self-sufficient grandeur might have suggested. She was embedded in a wide, largely invisible web of ships exchanging news of the sea ahead, ice included. But nothing in that web yet carried force enough to slow her, or to trouble the calm still settled comfortably over her decks and dining rooms. That particular kind of pressure, the kind that could actually alter what happened next, was building somewhere else entirely, not in the messages drifting down from the aerial wires above, but far below the waterline, where teams of men were steadily feeding the fires that gave this great ship her remarkable speed. That pressure building far below the waterline was not dramatic in itself. It was steady, ordinary, and entirely necessary, the kind of labor that never appears on a passenger's itinerary, but without which no part of the evening above could have happened at all. This was the world of the boiler rooms, and it ran on its own rhythm, indifferent to dinner menus or Morse code, answerable only to the demands of steam. Titanic's power came from burning coal in enormous quantities, and that coal did not sit and wait to be used. It had to be moved over and over, from storage bunkers to the furnace fronts, by men whose entire working night consisted of that single repeated task. These men were called trimmers, and their job, however unglamorous it sounds, was essential to everything happening above them. Without trimmers keeping coal flowing steadily to the firemen who fed the furnaces, no amount of engineering design would have kept Titanic moving at her accustomed pace across the Atlantic. One of these trimmers, a man named George Cavell, later gave testimony describing where he had been and what he had done that night. According to his account, he was working in boiler room number 4, one of several such spaces arranged along the length of the ship, each a self-contained unit of furnaces, coal, and labor. Cavell described the layout of his section in specific terms: 6 doors and 4 bunkers, a configuration that required more than one man working at a time. The trimmers in number 4 worked as a coordinated group, moving coal from the bunkers through the doors and toward the fires in a pattern that had to be sustained continuously, hour after hour, if the boilers were to keep producing the steam pressure the engines required. This was not occasional or emergency labor. Cavell testified that the fires in number 4 had been lit on the very first day the ship began her voyage and had been kept burning ever since. That detail matters because it tells us something important about the nature of this work on the night of April 14th. It was routine. It was the same task these men had performed since Titanic left Southampton, repeated at the same pace, in the same spaces, according to the same division of labor. Nothing unusual was happening in the boiler rooms that evening. The ship needed steam needed coal, and coal needed men to move it, so the men moved it as they had every night before. It is worth pausing on what this work actually meant physically, though the precise details of temperature and noise inside those spaces are not fully recoverable from the records available to us. We can say with reasonable confidence and without overstating what we know that boiler rooms on coal-fired steamships of this era were hot, loud, and physically demanding environments. Furnace fronts radiated heat that would have been considerable even in the cooler compartments, and the boiler rooms themselves would have carried the steady metallic clatter of shovels, the hiss of steam systems, and the low roar of the fires themselves. Reconstructing the exact sensory experience of any one man on any one night goes beyond what testimony like Cavell's can support, but the general shape of the labor, heat, noise, repetition, is consistent with what we know of stokehold work across the era's great liners. The men who did this work were sometimes referred to collectively by a nickname that had grown up around this kind of labor, the Black Gang. The name came from the coal dust that covered these workers almost constantly, dust that clung to skin and clothing no matter how carefully a man worked, turning faces and forearms a persistent shade of black by the end of a shift. It is a term used broadly for the firemen, trimmers, and stokers who kept ships like Titanic moving, and it captures something true about the visible cost of this labor, even if it cannot tell us the specific experience of any particular man in any particular boiler room that night. The division of labor below decks followed its own internal logic, separate from anything happening in the dining saloon or the wireless cabin above. Trimmers like Cavell moved coal from bunker to furnace front. Firemen, sometimes called stokers, took that coal and fed it into the furnaces themselves, working the fire doors, spreading coal evenly across the grates, raking out ash and clinker, and watching the burn closely enough to keep steam pressure where it needed to be. Other accounts from Titanic's firemen, describing their ordinary shifts, mention long stretches of continuous shoveling, the physical strain of maintaining that pace for hours at a time, and the discipline required to keep pressure gauges steady. These were not tasks that could be done in bursts and then set aside. Steam pressure, once lost, took real time to rebuild, and a ship moving at speed through the North Atlantic needed that pressure held constant, watch after watch, through the whole of the night. It is worth noting, too, what this labor cannot tell us, at least not with any certainty the surviving evidence can support. There is no reliable record of specific speed decisions being made hour by hour on this particular evening, nor any precise figures connecting a given shovelful of coal to a given increase in the ship's forward motion. What we can say, grounded in testimony like Cavell's and in general accounts of the firemen's work, is that the engineering routine was operating exactly as it always had. Fires lit since the voyage began, trimmers moving coal in coordinated teams, boiler rooms divided into sections that each required several men working together to keep pace with demand. The precise mechanics linking that labor to Titanic's exact rate of travel through the water belong to a more technical history than personal testimony alone can offer. What matters, for the purposes of this particular night, is the plain fact of continuity. Whatever the ship was doing above the waterline, dinner service concluding, stewards resetting pantries, wireless operators receiving word of ice somewhere ahead, the boiler rooms were doing exactly what they had done every night of the crossing so far. Men moved coal, other men fed it to the fires. Pressure gauges were checked, adjusted, and checked again. This was not glamorous work, and it left few individual traces in the historical record beyond testimony like Cavell's, given after the fact, describing a section of the ship most passengers never saw and probably never thought to imagine. But it was this work, steady and repetitive and physically demanding, that gave Titanic her motion at all. She did not glide through the water simply because she was well designed. She moved because men in her boiler rooms kept her moving, one shovelful at a time, through an evening that felt to them, so far as the record allows us to say, like any other evening of the crossing. That sense of ordinary continuation is worth holding on to as the night wears on. Nothing in the available testimony suggests any change in this routine as the hours passed. No unusual orders, no hint that the men below decks sensed anything different in the work still ahead of them. The fires burned as they had burned since the first day out. The coal moved as it had always moved, bunker to door to furnace, in the same practiced order. And while all of this labor continued below the waterline in its accustomed rhythm, up above in the cold air along the open decks, a very different kind of evening was unfolding, one made of footsteps, murmured conversation, and the small, unremarkable observations of passengers taking their last walks before turning in for the night. Up above, in the cold air along the open decks, that different kind of evening was already well underway, one made of footsteps, murmured conversation, and the small, unremarkable observations of passengers taking their last walks before turning in for the night. Earlier that evening, while the boiler rooms held their patient rhythm and the dining saloon still glittered with its final courses, a number of first-class passengers had already found their way outside. One woman later recalled going up on deck sometime between 5 and 6 o'clock, walking back and forth with a friend along the promenade before eventually settling into a chair near the companionway. It was, by her account, an unremarkable stretch of afternoon turning into evening, the kind of hour a great liner offers almost automatically to anyone who wants fresh air and a change of scenery. She remembered the sky as distinctly pink around 6 o'clock, a small and lovely detail that tells us the weather that evening began not in grayness or foreboding, but in something closer to a calm, colorful close to the day. That same passenger later described her husband leaving her company to walk and talk with another gentleman on deck, the sort of loose, sociable rearrangement that happens naturally when people who know each other cross paths in a public space. At one point, by her account, one of the ship's senior officials came up and exchanged a few words with her as she sat near the companionway. None of this suggests urgency or particular importance. It suggests exactly what we would expect from a ship still fully absorbed in the ordinary sociability of an Atlantic crossing. People moved, paused, spoke, and moved again, threading through each other's evenings the way passengers on any long voyage tend to do. We should be careful here about what this kind of testimony can and cannot tell us. It gives us a believable human-scale picture of the deck being used right through the late afternoon and into the beginning of evening, with walking, sitting, and casual conversation clearly part of that hour. It does not give us a precise minute-by-minute account of everyone's movements, nor does it describe every deck or every passenger. What we can say, grounded in this kind of first-hand recollection, is that the outer decks were still socially alive well into that evening, not empty or forgotten spaces waiting for something to happen. As the light faded further and true evening settled in, the character of being outside would have shifted, as it always does at sea. The wind that feels mild in late afternoon sun often turns sharper once the sun is gone, and a North Atlantic crossing in April carries a particular kind of cold that settles into wool coats and gloved hands within a few minutes of stepping outside. It is reasonable, without claiming to know the exact hour or the exact temperature, to imagine passengers adjusting for this, buttoning coats a little higher, tucking blankets more securely around their knees if they were sitting in deck chairs, perhaps deciding that a 5-minute stroll was preferable to a lengthy one. This is not a documented detail so much as an entirely ordinary inference about what any traveler does when the evening air turns colder on an open promenade. The ship's lamps, strung along the promenade decks and glowing from cabin windows above, would have thrown long, warm strips of light across the polished planking, marking out safe paths for anyone walking after dark. Passengers moving along the deck at this hour were not navigating by starlight alone. The ship provided its own soft geography of illumination, one deck room spilling into the next, portholes glowing gold against the darker sky. This, too, is a matter of ordinary shipboard reconstruction rather than a specific recorded observation, but it is consistent with everything we know about how a liner of this size lit its public spaces after sunset. What we do have more solid testimony for comes from later that night, after the collision, when at least one survivor made a point of walking a complete circuit of the deck and looking carefully in every direction. He described the night by then as beautiful, cloudless, and full of stars, though noticeably cold once you stood still in it for more than a moment. It is worth being honest about the limits of this evidence. It describes conditions after the ship had already struck the ice, not the hours immediately before. Still, weather at sea rarely transforms in an instant, and it is reasonable to think that the clear, cold, starlit character of that later night had been building gradually through the earlier evening hours as well, even if we cannot say precisely when the wind picked up or exactly how visible the stars had been an hour or two earlier. That same witness also described a striking, memorable image from later in the night, an older couple, still composed, seated together in steamer chairs on one of the glass-enclosed promenade decks, apparently untroubled by whatever had just occurred elsewhere on the ship. even allowing for the fact that this moment comes from after the iceberg had already been struck. It says something important about the general temperament of the evening leading up to it. This was not a ship where people rushed anxiously from place to place. It was a ship where, even in a moment we now know to have been serious, some passengers responded by doing exactly what they had been doing all evening, sitting calmly together, wrapped against the cold, watching the sea. Taken together, these fragments, a pink sky at 6 o'clock, a couple walking and talking along the promenade, an officer pausing to exchange a few words, lamps glowing steadily along the deck, and later, a night turning colder and brighter with stars, sketch a coherent picture, even though no single account covers the whole evening. The open decks were not an afterthought to the ship's social life. They were simply another room, larger and colder than the ones below, where the same unhurried rhythm of conversation and companionship continued outdoors. Nothing in this picture suggests worry. If anything, it suggests confidence, a willingness to stand outside in the cold Atlantic air simply because the evening and the ship carrying it still felt entirely secure. By the time full darkness had settled over Titanic, then, both her public rooms and her open decks were telling the same story. Inside, dinner had given way to conversation and coffee. Outside, walkers had given way to sitters, and sitters to those simply watching the horizon, coats buttoned against a wind that was growing steadily sharper as the night went on. The ship still felt vast, warm at her core, and thoroughly in command of herself, even as that cold outer air and the darkening water beneath it quietly asked for more attention than anyone on her open decks yet realized they needed to give. That cold outer air and the darkening water beneath it was already a fact known to the men whose job it was to think about such things, even while passengers on the open decks simply felt the wind sharpen and turned back toward the warmth of the lounges. On the bridge, and high above it in the crow's nest, a smaller group of officers and lookouts carried a different kind of awareness that night, one built not from sensation, but from information passed along earlier in the day. Messages received over the wireless had told them, in plain terms, that ice lay somewhere ahead along their track. This was not secret knowledge, and it was not treated as especially alarming. It was simply part of the working picture that any competent watch officer carried into the small hours, filed alongside wind, temperature, and course, to be managed rather than feared outright. By the time the ship had settled into her nighttime rhythm, she had already passed into the stretch of the North Atlantic where ice was known to drift southward in April, carried down by currents from the waters near Newfoundland. The position later read into the official inquiry record places Titanic squarely inside that seasonal ice field, not somewhere unconnected to it. In other words, the ship was not caught by surprise in a place no one expected ice to be. She was moving, deliberately and at speed, through a stretch of ocean where such danger was already understood to be plausible, even likely, on that particular crossing. The men on watch knew this in the way a person knows a road is prone to fog, not as a certainty about the next mile, but as a standing condition worth carrying in mind. What made the situation harder to judge from the bridge was not ignorance of the general risk, but the way that risk failed to announce itself through the senses. The sea that night was widely described as calm, almost unnaturally so, without the usual swell or broken water that might otherwise betray the presence of a large obstruction. Ordinarily, an iceberg reveals itself partly through the sea around it, through white water breaking against its submerged mass, through a faint disturbance visible even at some distance in poor light. On a calm night, none of that natural signaling was available. The ocean lay flat and black, offering no obvious seam between safe water and hidden danger, which meant a lookout's task depended almost entirely on catching the berg itself as a shape or a shadow, rather than on any secondary clue rising from the surface around it. Frederick Fleet, stationed in the Crow's Nest as one of the lookouts on duty that watch, later gave testimony describing exactly this kind of difficulty. His account, given at length before both the American and British inquiries, described a night in which nothing ahead looked wrong until very close to the moment when something suddenly did. This detail is worth sitting with plainly because it tells us something important about what watchfulness actually meant on a night like this one. Fleet was not inattentive, and no reliable account suggests carelessness on his part. He was doing the job he had been assigned, in the dark and cold, scanning a horizon that gave back almost nothing useful, until the object he was watching for finally resolved into something visible, rather than remaining an absence in the dark. Down on the bridge, the officers on watch were managing a related but distinct problem, not simply looking outward, but translating the ship's known heading and speed into a judgment about what that combination meant, given what had already been reported about ice along the route. Robert Hitchens, who was at the wheel through this stretch of the night, later described in testimony the ordinary mechanics of steering and course-keeping in the period leading up to the collision. It is the kind of routine, procedural detail that rarely makes for dramatic reading, yet it matters enormously for reconstructing what the watch was actually doing with its hands and attention in these final minutes. Nothing in that testimony suggests panic or improvisation. It suggests a bridge operating in its accustomed manner, following established practice, carrying an awareness of ice reports that had not yet translated into any specific, visible danger in front of them. That cold outer air and the darkening water beneath it was already a fact known to the men whose job it was to think about such things, even while passengers on the open decks simply felt the wind sharpen and turned back toward the warmth of the lounges. On the bridge and high above it in the Crow's Nest, a smaller group of officers and auscriptors await themselves for all their disagreement on smaller points of timing and course, did not find grounds to claim otherwise. What the record supports instead is a picture of trained men doing a difficult job under conditions that worked against them in a particular, almost cruel way, cold enough to sharpen attention, calm enough to strip away the sea's usual warnings, and dark enough that visual confirmation of danger could only come at a range where the margin for reaction was already narrowing. The officers knew, in general terms, that they were in ice country that night. What they did not have and could not have manufactured from calm water and clear but moonless dark was an early, unmistakable visual cue pointing toward the particular hazard drifting somewhere ahead of them. This is why the evidence resists being told simply as a story of missed warnings or obvious mistakes. The wireless room had passed along what it had received earlier in the day, and that information had entered the ship's operational picture in the ordinary way such information does, as one more factor to be weighed by officers already managing course, speed, and lookout assignments through a long night at sea. The lookouts, for their part, were doing precisely what lookouts are meant to do, watching a stretch of black water and black sky for any deviation from nothing, which is a genuinely demanding thing to sustain hour after hour without visible reward. Vigilance on a night like this did not look like tension or urgency. It looked like ordinary men at ordinary posts, repeating a task that had so far produced no result, with no way of knowing how soon that would change. And so the ship carried on as she had, moving confidently through water that gave no outward sign of what it held, watched by men who understood the general risk but lacked the specific warning that only a sighted shape could provide. Nothing about the bridge or the Crow's Nest that hour, according to any account that survives, suggested imminent danger. The sea stayed calm. The air stayed cold and unusually clear in the way that made the stars overhead sharp and bright, while offering no comparable help in picking out a low, dark shape ahead on the water. Different witnesses would later disagree, in small but real ways, about exactly how dark it truly was, how far a lookout might reasonably have expected to see, and what, if anything, might have been done differently in those last minutes. Those disagreements are part of the honest record, and they resist being smoothed over into a single tidy account of the watch that night. What can be said with more confidence is simpler, and perhaps more unsettling for that simplicity. Routine held, the watch continued, unremarkable in every outward sense, exactly the sort of quiet, disciplined labor that had defined every other hour of this crossing. The ship moved on through calm, cold water that concealed exactly what it needed to conceal, until the moment came, quite suddenly, and with very little warning available to soften it, when watching finally gave way to seeing, and in that narrow gap between the two, there was almost no time left at all before the ship met whatever lay ahead of her in the dark. In that narrow gap between watching and seeing, the ship met the ice. What followed was not, for most people aboard, a moment of obvious drama. It was something smaller and stranger, a sensation that arrived, registered, and then had to be interpreted, often incorrectly, by people who had no reason yet to think the worst. For those in the forward part of the ship, closer to where the hull met the berg, the impact was felt as a shock and a noise, something sudden enough to interrupt sleep and pull attention sharply toward the starboard side. One passenger who was in that part of the ship later described being roused abruptly, aware at once that something unusual had happened forward, and immediately entertaining the thought that Titanic might have collided with another vessel. That guess is worth pausing on. It was not an unreasonable thought for someone jolted awake in the dark, and it shows how little the sound or motion of the moment resembled, in itself, the specific idea of ice. A collision suggested another ship. It did not suggest, at least not instantly, an iceberg sliding along beneath the waterline, unseen and already doing its damage. That same passenger, listening in the corridor just afterward, noted something almost as telling as the shock itself. There was no commotion, no shouting, no rush of feet, nothing that announced calamity. Instead, what followed the jolt was a different sound entirely, a loud rush of escaping steam, venting somewhere above or nearby with a steady, mechanical roar. It was not a sound of crisis in the way we might picture one now. It was closer to the sound of machinery being brought to an unplanned halt, which, in fact, it was. The engines had stopped, and the boilers, no longer needing to drive the ship forward, were releasing pressure through vents built for exactly that purpose. To ears not trained to think in terms of hull plates and rivets, it was simply a strange new noise layered over an unusually still ship. Further back and higher up, in first-class cabins nearer the ship's center, the experience could be entirely different. One first-class passenger recalled, in testimony given afterward, that she felt no jar at all. What she noticed instead was quieter and more indirect. The engines, which had been running beneath her for days as a kind of unnoticed pulse, simply stopped. She looked outside, by her own account, and saw a calm sea, nothing alarming in the water or the night. It was the absence of motion, not the presence of any shock, that told her something had changed. This detail matters because it undercuts any picture of the collision as something universally dramatic. For her, in her part of the ship, the iceberg produced no crash at all. It produced a stillness where there had been steady vibration only moments before. That stillness invited explanation, and in the minutes that followed, explanations began to circulate in the ordinary, informal way that information moves through a ship at night. Passed between passengers, guessed at by stewards, overheard in half-finished sentences near cabin doors. The passenger who felt nothing but the stopped engines recalled being told, when she asked, that there had been talk of ice, and that the ship had stopped in order to avoid it. It is a strikingly calm version of events, and probably a sincere one at the time it was given. Nobody offering that explanation was lying. They simply did not yet know more than that. It is worth remembering, too, that memory itself can smooth or reorder such moments in hindsight, so these recollections should be read as honest impressions rather than a precise transcript of the night. This is the heart of what makes the first minutes after the impact so difficult to render as pure spectacle. There was no single, universally felt catastrophe. There was a shock felt strongly by a few, faintly by others, and not at all by many more. There was a mechanical noise, the venting steam, that could easily be mistaken for a normal, if unusual, part of shipboard operation. There was the stopping of the engines, itself unfamiliar, but not obviously more menacing than a technical delay of some kind. And there was, almost immediately, a piece of half-correct reassurance moving informally through the decks, the idea that the ship had stopped because of ice, rather than because ice had already done something to her. For a stretch of time that we can only approximate, but which likely ran to several minutes at least, this partial, calm understanding held for a great many people aboard. Some passengers on the upper decks may have felt only mild curiosity, the sort that follows any unexplained pause in a long, otherwise smooth journey. Below decks, closer to the machinery spaces, others certainly understood more and sooner, simply because they were nearer to where the physical evidence of damage was already becoming apparent. But that understanding had not yet spread outward in any organized way. It moved instead the way rumor moves on a ship at night, unevenly through corridors, past half-open cabin doors, carried by whoever happened to be walking somewhere else with a look on their face that made others want to ask what was wrong. That same first-class passenger, the one who had heard only stopped engines and seen only a calm sea, offers one of the clearest markers of how slowly the full picture assembled itself. By her account, it was only after a noticeable stretch of time, something like 10 minutes by her own estimate, that she began to see people hurrying on deck in a way that felt different from ordinary late-night movement. It was then, she recalled, that she heard someone else calling for lifebelts, a detail sharp enough that it lodged in memory rather clearly. That call is worth noting precisely because of what it was not. It was not an announcement from the bridge, not a general alarm heard throughout the ship, not an obviously ship-wide declaration of danger. It was one voice, likely a passenger or crew member somewhere nearby, doing exactly what people do when they suddenly understand something others around them do not yet grasp. They say it out loud to whoever happens to be near enough to hear. This matters for understanding how the earliest phase of the emergency actually unfolded, as opposed to how we might picture it if we simply assumed everyone aboard immediately understood the ship was doomed. They did not. Some had felt a shock and guessed wrongly at a collision with another vessel. Others had felt nothing at all and been told, not unreasonably, that ice had merely caused a stop. The most concrete sign that something serious might be happening did not come from the impact itself, for most passengers, but from other people, their pace, their tone, the particular urgency of a stranger's voice asking for a lifebelt in a hallway that had been silent minutes before. It is worth pausing here on how differently damage and danger register from person to person, even aboard the same ship in the same few minutes. A shock felt in one cabin can be an unnoticed nothing 2 decks up. A sound that means catastrophe to an engineer can mean to a sleeping passenger only an unfamiliar noise worth a moment's curiosity before sleep reclaims them. Titanic's first minutes after striking the ice were exactly this kind of uneven experience, scattered across her length and height, understood in fragments rather than all at once, and pieced together only slowly by comparing one person's account to another's, sometimes for days afterward, and sometimes not until much later still. The order of the evening, the one that had held so steadily through dinner, through the steward's unnoticed labor, through wireless traffic and coal shoveled steadily into furnaces, through calm walks on the open decks, had now been broken, but it had not yet been replaced by anything resembling collective alarm. For a crucial stretch of time, the ship still looked, sounded, and felt to many aboard like herself, warm, brightly lit, faintly puzzling in her sudden stillness, but not yet frightening. That gap between what had actually happened below the waterline and what most people on board understood to have happened would not last long. Already in corridors and stairwells nearer the bow, officers and engineers were beginning to gather a different, far less reassuring kind of information about what the ship had struck and what it had already cost her. That gap between what had actually happened below the waterline and what most people on board understood to have happened was already closing, though slowly, and in pieces, as officers and engineers began the work of finding out exactly what the ship had struck and what it had cost her. The first indications came not as a single dramatic report, but as a scattering of small, physical signs that had to be noticed before they could be understood. Almost immediately after the collision, air could be heard hissing out through the Four Peaks overflow pipe, an ordinary-sounding noise that in fact meant water was already displacing air somewhere forward, low in the ship. It was the kind of detail easy to miss amid the general stir of a ship suddenly stopped, and it would only make sense in hindsight once other reports began arriving and confirming what that hiss had been trying to say all along. Those other reports came quickly and from several directions at once. Men working in spaces near the bow, some in the mailroom, some near the squash court, some among the firemen's quarters and storage holds forward, began finding water where there should have been none, and passing that discovery upward through whoever they could find. This was not a single messenger racing to the bridge with one clear account. It was closer to a rising chorus of separate, urgent observations, each one true in its own compartment, each one adding weight to a picture that was only slowly coming into focus for the officers trying to assemble it. Down in the forward boiler room, the evidence was harder to mistake for anything small. One of the leading firemen later described water forcing its way in through a tear in the ship's side, roughly 2 feet above the floor plates where the men stood working, and about 20 feet below the waterline outside. The opening did not stay confined to one space either. It reached sideways into the coal bunker as well, so that men who had been shoveling coal only minutes before now found the same space filling steadily around their boots. For anyone standing in that boiler room, there was little room left for the idea that this had been a glancing, harmless brush with the ice. It is worth pausing on how differently this moment must have felt in different parts of the ship. Passengers strolling the decks above still had almost nothing to go on beyond stopped engines and a faint change in the ship's motion. But in the forward boiler room, men were wading through cold water rising around machinery meant to stay dry, in a space lit by the same electric lamps that still burned steadily in the dining saloon overhead. The ship above and the ship below were, for those first minutes, living in two different stories entirely, and only gradually would those stories merge into one shared understanding, carried upward through a chain of increasingly alarming reports. That understanding did not arrive gently. According to later testimony before the British inquiry, the boiler room immediately aft of the damaged one, listed as number 6, was abandoned by its crew almost as soon as the collision occurred, a decision that on its own speaks plainly to how quickly the men closest to the machinery grasped the danger, even before anyone above them had fully assembled the larger picture. Abandoning a boiler room was not a small or hesitant act. It meant judging, in the moment, that staying was no longer safe, and that the water advancing toward that space could not simply be managed by ordinary means or ordinary patience. As reports accumulated, they began to describe not one damaged compartment, but several in sequence, running along the ship's forward length. The same British inquiry later concluded that all 6 compartments forward of boiler room number 4 had been opened to the sea, with damage reaching roughly 10 feet above the keel, and that within about 10 minutes the water inside those spaces had already climbed to somewhere near 14 feet above the keel. Whether every officer standing near the bridge in those first minutes grasped the full weight of that figure is impossible to say with certainty. What the evidence does show is that the flooding was neither isolated nor slow, and that anyone receiving even a partial version of these reports would have understood the ship was now facing something far beyond a routine mishap. It is worth being honest here about the limits of what the record actually preserves. No single surviving document lays out, minute by minute, exactly which man inspected which compartment first, or precisely when each report reached which officer's ear. What survives instead is testimony, gathered afterward under formal questioning, from men recalling a chaotic and urgent sequence of events they had lived through only once, under conditions of stress and rapidly shifting information. The broad shape of that sequence is clear and consistent across multiple witnesses. Reports arrived quickly from several directions, describing flooding in more than one compartment at once, and this pattern itself was unusual enough to demand serious attention. But the exact order of conversations and the tone in which they were delivered remains partly a matter of reconstruction rather than settled record, and later dramatized retellings that compress this into one single decisive report should be treated with some caution. What can be stated with more confidence is the effect all of this had on the ship's most senior officer. According to testimony given afterward to the United States Senate inquiry, the various reports reaching the captain in this period must have quickly acquainted him with the seriousness of the ship's condition, and this understanding was later reflected in his own responses when he was directly questioned about the danger by the White Star Line's managing director, who happened to be traveling aboard as a passenger. That exchange, brief as it apparently was, marks a clear hinge point in how the emergency was understood at the highest level, not as a lingering mystery still being puzzled out, but as a danger already recognized and now requiring a response. That shift mattered enormously, because it changed what kind of ship this now was, at least in the minds of the men responsible for her. Minutes earlier, officers on the bridge had been dealing with an unexpected but ambiguous event, something that might, for all anyone above decks yet knew, have been a glancing strike with no lasting consequence. Now, armed with reports of multiple flooded compartments, a breached boiler room, and water rising far faster than any ordinary damage could explain, they were dealing with something else entirely. A ship taking on water across a significant length of her forward hull, with no clear means yet identified to stop it, and very little time available to find one. It would be tempting, looking back, to imagine this moment as a single clean turning point, one decision made in one instant of clarity. The evidence instead suggests something messier and more human. Officers and engineers working with partial, arriving information, each new report narrowing the range of comfortable explanations a little further, until the accumulated weight of those reports left little room for anything but urgent action. The curiosity that had followed the first shudder through the ship was giving way, piece by piece, compartment by compartment, to something far more serious, and the men now gathered near the bridge understood that whatever came next could no longer wait on further confirmation from below. It was this hardening certainty, arriving report after report from the forward end of the ship, that would soon carry the captain and his officers out onto the decks themselves, where a very different kind of work was about to begin, gathering crew, uncovering the lifeboats, and turning grim understanding into the first uncertain steps of an evacuation. That hardening certainty below decks was about to carry itself upward, out of the engineering spaces and into the ordinary business of corridors and cabins where most passengers still knew nothing at all. It was this understanding, arriving report after report from the forward end of the ship, that pushed the captain and his officers into a decision they had been circling for some minutes. The ship could not live much longer, and the time had come to uncover the boats. The order went out sometime around midnight, though exactly which minute varies a little from one witness account to another, as such things often do when everyone involved is working quickly and by lamplight rather than by clock. What matters more than the precise moment is what the order set in motion. 14 boats, arranged along the boat deck under their davits, were to be freed of their covers and made ready. This was not yet a call to fill them, it was preparation, the kind of task a well-drilled crew could carry out without necessarily believing the worst, and many of the men doing the work likely still held some hope that it would prove unnecessary. At the same time, a second and less visible kind of work began, carried out not by officers on the open deck, but by stewards moving through the ship's interior corridors. Their task was less technical and more human, waking passengers who had already gone to sleep or who had simply retired to their cabins without any clear sense that anything was wrong, and telling them to dress warmly and come up. This is the point at which the evening's calm, which had held so steadily through dinner and boiler room labor and late walks along the promenade, began to crack, cabin by cabin, corridor by corridor. The steward's approach seems to have varied by circumstance and by deck, but the general pattern is well attested. They knocked, they explained as much as they knew, and they helped passengers into the cumbersome canvas and cork lifebelts that few aboard had ever worn or even seen up close before that night. For some passengers, this was almost comic, an awkward fitting of unfamiliar gear over evening clothes or night clothes, fumbled with cold fingers in a cabin lit dimly against the late hour. For others, it was the first moment the earlier bump or the earlier hush of stopped engines resolved into something that required action rather than curiosity. One first-class passenger's account gives a useful sense of how uncertain this moment still felt from below decks, even as the machinery of evacuation was starting to turn above her. She had heard talk of an iceberg, but was told only that the ship had stopped to avoid one, a piece of information that explained the stop without suggesting any real danger. She put on a warm wrapper, the ordinary outer garment a person reaches for on a cold ship at a strange hour, and waited for further instruction rather than rushing anywhere. It is a small, unremarkable detail, and that is precisely why it matters. It shows a passenger behaving as though this were an inconvenience to be managed with patience, not an emergency to be fled. That kind of reasonable, unhurried response appears to have been common in these first minutes. Passengers likely gathered coats and, in some cases, important papers, the sort of practical instinct that comes from packing for a journey rather than escaping a sinking ship. Sleepy children were probably lifted and carried by parents, or bundled into extra layers, again in a manner consistent with an unwelcome but temporary disturbance rather than a crisis. None of this is difficult to imagine, and it fits naturally with everything the record does establish, though it is worth being honest that the surviving evidence speaks most directly to lifebelts and escorting rather than to every gesture of this kind. The finer details of coats and carried children belong to plausible, ordinary human behavior rather than to a specific documented moment. Up on the boat deck itself, the work of preparing the boats was proceeding, but not quickly. Crew arrived gradually rather than all at once, and by most accounts no more than about 3 deckhands were assigned, on average, to each boat in these early stages. This was not a large or immediately available workforce for 14 boats spread along both sides of a very large ship. Men had to be found, sent for, and organized, often while still absorbing the same uncertain information that was circulating among the passengers. The result was a boat deck that, for a time, looked more like a scene of unhurried maintenance than the beginning of an evacuation. Ropes being freed, covers pulled back, davits swung, all performed with the same competence a crew might bring to any drill, because for many of them that is initially what it resembled. By around 20 minutes past midnight, when the order came to swing the boats out from the ship's side, only a few passengers had actually made their way up to the deck. This detail is worth sitting with because it captures the whole character of this stage of the night. The crew was ahead of the passengers, not because passengers were being deliberately delayed, but because waking, dressing, fastening an unfamiliar lifebelt, and climbing several decks upward through a large ship all took real time, and because most people had no urgent reason yet to move quickly. In an important sense, the evacuation had begun in a technical and procedural way well before it had begun in the minds of most people it would eventually carry away from the ship. It is worth resisting the temptation, so easy in hindsight, to read this slowness as carelessness or denial. Given what most passengers actually knew at this point, a measured, almost skeptical response was entirely rational. They had felt at most a mild shudder, heard the engines stop, and been told, if they were told anything specific at all, that the ship had struck ice and paused as a precaution. Life belts and boat drills, however unfamiliar, could still be understood as an excess of caution by a well-run ship, rather than as a genuine prelude to abandoning her. The stewards, moving cabin to cabin, were, in effect, translating an emergency that officers and engineers already understood in stark terms into a far more careful, ambiguous message for those still largely unaware of the flooding below. That gentler translation could not hold indefinitely. As more passengers reached the boat deck and as the boat swung out and hung visibly against the night sky over black water, the earlier, more comfortable interpretations would grow harder to sustain. Corridors that had been merely disturbed a short while earlier were now filling with the sound of doors opening, feet on stairs, and low voices asking questions that stewards could not fully answer. The scene was still orderly, still largely calm on its surface, but it was no longer a scene of sleep interrupted for a minor precaution. The crew's methodical, still measured preparations were about to meet a colder, more specific requirement, one that would soon begin sorting the gathering crowd not simply into those willing to board and those inclined to wait, but into categories the officers themselves would have to name aloud and enforce as the night's remaining time grew shorter than almost anyone standing on that deck yet realized. The gathering crowd on the boat deck, still uncertain what any of this meant, was about to be sorted by a rule that required no explanation and admitted no argument. Somewhere near midnight, by the reckoning that survives in later testimony, the order went out to begin placing women and children into the boats. It was not a suggestion offered gently to a worried crowd. It was an instruction given with the plain authority of officers who understood, even if most passengers did not yet fully grasp it, that time had become the one resource the ship could no longer spare. The work proceeded quickly once that order was given, though quickly is a relative word aboard a ship where nothing had ever needed to move with true urgency before. Boats that had been uncovered shortly after midnight and swung out into position not long after that were now approached with purpose. The first lowering order, for one of the boats on the starboard side, came at around 1:45, and from that point onward the loading of women and children became the organizing principle of everything happening on deck. Men stepped back, some without hesitation, some with a visible reluctance they tried to disguise as courtesy. Wives looked at husbands. Children were lifted, half asleep, over gunwales they could not have understood the importance of. And the officers, moving between boats with a controlled briskness, kept repeating the same instruction in one form or another. Women and children first, men stand back. That phrase, plain as it sounds, carried enormous weight in practice. It did not distinguish between a first-class passenger descending from her stateroom in a fur coat and a woman from third class who had come up several decks through corridors she barely knew how to navigate. According to testimony later given by one of the junior officers responsible for several of the boats, there was no formal selection by class at this stage of the loading. The first woman to arrive at a boat was the first woman into it, whoever she happened to be, and wherever she happened to have come from. This is worth pausing on, because it complicates any simple story of the disaster as a strict reflection of the ship's social hierarchy. The rule that governed the boats, at least in its stated form and in these opening minutes, was about sex and age, not standing, though how faithfully that ideal held up as the night wore on is a separate matter entirely. Whether the rule was applied with perfect evenness across every boat and every deck is a question the surviving accounts do not allow a tidy answer to. The boat deck was long, and the boats were distributed along its length under the charge of different officers, each managing his own small stretch of the effort according to his own judgment and his own reading of the moment. Testimony describes a working division of responsibility, specific boats overseen by specific men, one officer taking charge of several boats scattered across both the port and starboard sides, another concentrated more narrowly near the bow, a senior officer moving along the port side to assist wherever the work seemed to require another pair of steady hands. This division was practical rather than ceremonial. It meant that a woman standing at one boat might have her path smoothed by a particular officer's calm insistence, while a woman 30 yards away at a different boat under different supervision might encounter more confusion, more delay, or a slightly different interpretation of who counted as ready to go. It is reasonable to imagine, though it cannot be stated as established fact, that passengers experienced these first loadings in strikingly different ways, depending on exactly where they stood. Someone near a boat where the process moved with brisk, almost mechanical order might have come away from the night believing the evacuation had been calm and well managed from the very beginning. Someone 30 yards down the deck, delayed by a knot of confused stewards or an officer still working out how full a boat needed to be before it could be lowered safely, might have remembered the same 20 minutes as tense, uncertain, and slow. Neither impression would be wrong. Both would simply reflect the fact that this was not one evacuation happening uniformly across a single deck, but many small, semi-independent evacuations happening in parallel, each shaped by its own officer, its own crowd, and its own particular share of luck. Beneath this immediate work on deck, the stewards continued their part of the effort, moving through corridors and stairwells to bring up passengers who had not yet appeared, checking cabins, repeating instructions about lifebelts, and guiding people who had never walked these particular passageways in the dark toward the stairs that led up and out into the cold. Their labor was less visible than the loading itself, but it fed directly into it. Every woman and child who arrived at a boat had, in most cases, been roused, dressed, and steered there by someone whose name would likely never appear in any passenger's account of the night, and whose ordinary competence made the more dramatic scenes on deck possible at all. Without that unseen chain of small, repeated acts, the boats above would have had far fewer women and children to fill them, and far less time in which to do it. For the men left standing back, the experience of these minutes must have varied enormously depending on temperament and circumstance, though almost none of it survives in reliable detail. Some seem to have accepted the arrangement without complaint, understanding it as the expected order of things aboard a ship in danger. Others lingered near the rail, watching wives and daughters lowered away into the dark without any clear sense of when or whether they themselves might follow. It is plausible, though not something that can be pinned to a specific voice or moment, that a number of these men still believed rescue would come from another ship long before their own situation became a serious threat to them personally. That belief, wherever it existed, would have made the separation feel less final than it actually was. As the loading continued, boat by boat, the earlier sense of an orderly, almost leisurely precaution began to give way to something with a harder edge. Officers still worked with discipline, still followed the same governing rule, but the pace quickened, and the margin for gentle persuasion narrowed along with it. Passengers arriving late to a boat that was already being prepared for lowering found themselves facing decisions made in seconds rather than minutes. The controlled calm that had marked the very first boats did not vanish, but it was joined now by an unmistakable urgency, visible in the officers' shortened sentences and the stewards' quickened steps, even as the full scale of what lay ahead of the ship remained largely unspoken among those still standing on the open deck. By this stage, the ship's earlier calm exterior had essentially disappeared, replaced by a determined, still largely organized, but increasingly pressured effort to save as many lives as the boats could hold. The rule of women and children first remained the backbone of the process, applied inconsistently in its details but consistently in its intent, across a deck now crowded with people whose understanding of the danger ranged from mild curiosity to genuine unspoken fear. Somewhere in that unevenness lay the truth of the night, not one clean story of order or of failure, but dozens of smaller stories, each true from where it was witnessed, each incomplete on its own. What waited beyond these first boats in the stretch of cold hours still to come would test that fragile order even further, as those left behind turned toward the longer, harder work of simply enduring what remained of the dark. The truth of that unevenness could not be resolved from any single vantage point on deck. It simply had to be lived through, hour by cold hour, by everyone still standing on Titanic's tilting decks. The boats kept leaving, but not quickly, and not in any way that felt to those waiting like one continuous event. Testimony gathered afterward by investigators describes an evacuation stretched across a long span of time rather than a single mass departure, and that pacing shaped the entire texture of the wait. A boat would be loaded, lowered, and rowed off into the dark, and then there would be an interval, sometimes short, sometimes much longer, before the next one began to fill. For those left on deck during these gaps, the night became less one crisis than a sequence of smaller ones, each arriving, being managed, and giving way to another stretch of standing and watching. The night could becoming impossible to ignore. One crew member on watch that night later described the air as bitterly sharp, the sky clear and thick with stars, and the sea unusually calm. He noticed something stranger too, fine splinters of ice forming around the ship's lights, catching their glow and scattering it into faint colors, almost like a halo around each lamp. It was a small, almost delicate detail amid everything else happening, but it captured something true about the conditions that night, a world turning steadily colder and more brittle even as it remained on its surface eerily still and beautiful. That stillness mattered, because there was so little wind and so little motion in the water. Sound carried with unusual clarity across the decks. Small sounds, a shouted order, a block creaking as a boat descended, a child crying somewhere below, seemed to travel farther than they should have. People spoke in lower voices, not entirely by design, but because the night itself seemed to discourage anything louder. What laughter there still was in these earlier hours sounded oddly isolated, quickly swallowed by the cold air rather than shared outward. The ship herself was changing shape beneath their feet, gradually and almost imperceptibly at first. The decks were no longer quite level. Passengers and crew moving along them began to notice a faint slope, barely perceptible near the stern, more obvious toward the bow, and small objects, deck chairs, coiled ropes, discarded glasses, had begun very slowly to shift with it. This tilt would only grow more pronounced as the night wore on, but even now it was there for anyone standing still long enough to notice, a subtle but unmistakable sign that the ship's usual sense of levelness was no longer something anyone could quite take for granted. Despite this, much of the ship remained lit and, in a strange way, orderly. Electric lights burned steadily through many of her public rooms and corridors, and this steady illumination did real work in shaping how people understood their situation. A ship that still blazed with light down every corridor did not look to many aboard like a ship that could possibly be sinking, whatever the deck's incline seemed to suggest. This contradiction between the visible comfort of the interior and the physical evidence of change underfoot appears to have sustained much of the disbelief that persisted well into the night, allowing many passengers to wait rather than resist, to trust the crew's calm instructions rather than question them, simply because so much of their surroundings still looked and felt like the ship they had boarded days before. Officers and crew continued the practical work of loading boats, and testimony from the official inquiry afterward makes clear that this labor did not slacken, even as fewer boats remained to be launched. Crew members moved along the boat deck, calling for women and children, helping people over the gunwales, uncoiling ropes, working the lowering mechanisms, often repeating the same instructions to new arrivals from below. It was steady, repetitive work carried out by people who could reasonably guess by this point how serious the situation truly was, even if that certainty could not always be spoken aloud to the passengers they were assisting. The boats kept leaving. Waiting itself became its own strange task. Some paced, others stood in small groups near the rail, watching boats already in the water pull slowly away, their lanterns growing smaller against the black sea. A few, it seems reasonable to infer without claiming precise detail, sat wrapped in blankets in deck chairs that had earlier that evening held nothing more serious than idle readers and unhurried conversation. The mood among them was not uniform. Some clung to the belief that this remained, at bottom, a precaution, that the ship would not truly be lost, that rescue or repair would soon turn the whole ordeal into a story to tell rather than a memory to carry. Others, especially among the crew and a few passengers with maritime experience, understood with growing clarity that no such comfortable outcome remained available to them. Wireless activity continued through all of this, message after message sent into the dark toward any ship close enough to hear. That work, largely invisible to those standing on the open decks, represented another kind of urgency running parallel to the loading of boats. Whatever reassurance passengers found in lit corridors or calm water, the operators sending distress calls into the night understood exactly how much time might or might not remain, and how much now depended on some distant vessel receiving their signal and turning toward it. As the night deepened, ordinary routine persisted in ways that seem almost startling in hindsight. The same crew member who noted the ice crystals forming around the lights also recorded that he was called to stand a middle watch at midnight, a small, almost bureaucratic detail that speaks to how thoroughly normal shipboard procedure continued, even as the extraordinary unfolded around it. Men still reported for duty. Watches were still called and relieved, even after the collision, even as boats swung outward on their falls. The machinery of a disciplined ship kept turning, because that discipline was, in its own way, the only steady thing many aboard had left to hold on to. The cold sharpened further as the hours passed, working through coats and blankets, turning breath visible in the lamplight. Fewer people walked now, more simply stood or sat, waiting for boats that arrived at increasingly uneven intervals, watching officers work ropes and pulleys with hands growing stiff in the temperature. Whatever conversation continued tended toward the practical rather than the emotional, which side to board from, whether children ought to be handed down first, whether it was truly necessary to leave belongings behind. Larger fears, when they surfaced at all, seemed to have been voiced quietly, and mostly to those already closest and most trusted. Through all of it, the ship's angle went on increasing by slow degrees, the sea drawing nearer to portholes and railings that had begun the evening a comfortable distance above the waterline. Dawn remained hours away, and no one standing on those decks yet knew how many boats were left to launch, how much time truly remained, or what the coming light, once it finally broke over the water, would reveal to those still waiting for it. The angle of the deck itself had already answered the question that words could not. By that last stretch of the night, the bow had gone down so far that the forward rail met the sea almost without transition, and those still aboard understood, in whatever way each of them could bear to understand it, that the time for waiting had ended. What happened in Titanic's final minutes is remembered only in fragments, and those fragments do not agree with one another in every detail. Survivors described the ship's lights holding on, flickering, and then failing, though the order and the exact moment differ from one account to the next. Some remembered a great breaking sound, a structural groan passed along the length of the hull, as though the ship's frame were announcing, in the only language available to it, that it could no longer hold its own shape together. Others recalled something less like a single dramatic event and more like a slow surrender, deck after deck disappearing beneath water that had, until that hour, seemed content to rise no further. Whether the ship broke apart before it sank, and in what sequence, remains disputed among those who watched from boats that were themselves being rowed and pushed away from the immediate area, and it would be dishonest to present any one version of those final moments as settled fact. What can be said with more confidence is the general time. Survivors in the lifeboats placed the ship's disappearance at around 20 minutes past 2 in the morning, though exact minutes varied by witness, by watch, and by how closely anyone happened to be paying attention in that particular instant. What happened deck disappearing beneath water that they could check par nuomet, that is shifting, half-seen event, viewed from a distance across water that carried sound unevenly and hid as much as it revealed. Some described the ship's stern lifting, dark against a sky with no moon to help anyone judge distance or size. Others remembered only a suggestion of movement, a shape growing smaller, then not there at all, with no distinct final instant they could later swear to. And then, whatever had happened, happened. The lights that had marked the ship's position for those in the boats simply were not there anymore. What replaced the ship on the horizon was not wreckage, not visible struggle, but an absence, sudden in its completion, even if the process leading to it had been anything but sudden. That absence created a new kind of problem for the people in the boats, one that had nothing to do with the ship anymore, and everything to do with the boats themselves. Once Titanic was gone, the boats no longer had a shared point of reference, a lit shape to row toward or away from, and they began, in the darkness that followed, to separate from one another in ways that had not been obvious while the ship still stood as a landmark. Some boats stayed close enough to call between one another, exchanging what little information anyone had. Others drifted out of earshot, out of sight, each carrying its own small, isolated portion of the night. This scattering was not the result of any single decision. It happened gradually, boat by boat, as currents and the work of oars carried each one along its own uncertain path across water that offered no landmarks and very little light to steer by. One survivor's account, recorded among the testimonies gathered afterward, describes the boats spreading out from the sinking site in a shape like an open fan, each vessel drawing away from the others along its own line rather than holding together as a single group. That image is useful less as a precise measurement than as a way of understanding what the hours after 2:20 actually felt like. Not a fleet of lifeboats moving in coordinated fashion, but a loose scattering of small craft, each occupied with its own passengers, its own cold, its own uncertainty about what, if anything, was coming to help. Some of these boats, in that account, later had to cross back over the very stretch of water where the ship had gone down in order to reach the rescue ship that eventually found them, a detail that speaks to how disordered the geography of that night had become, even for the people living through it. The cold, already a fact of the evening's air, became a far more immediate concern once the ship was gone and its lights no longer offered any comfort. People in the boats, many still dressed for a warm dining room rather than an open sea in April, spent hours with little to occupy them beyond watching the horizon and waiting. Conversation in the boats, where it happened at all, tended toward practical matters: who was missing, who might still be found, whether a light seen in the distance meant anything or nothing. In at least one surviving account, passengers in a boat believed, for a stretch of time near 3 in the morning, that a faint glow on the horizon marked the beginning of dawn, only to realize, with a mixture of relief and disappointment, that what they were looking at was the northern lights rather than the sun. That confusion, recorded by one witness among several similar impressions, says something true about the whole stretch of hours before real rescue arrived. Almost everyone in the boats was straining to read meaning into a dark sky that offered very little to work with, and the line between hope and misreading was thin enough that people crossed it more than once before morning actually came. The rescue ship that would eventually reach the survivors is believed, by later timeline reconstructions, to have arrived in the general area by around 3:30 in the morning, though this too rests on records assembled after the fact rather than any single synchronized observation from the boats themselves. For the people still adrift, this meant that help was already technically present in the darkness before any of them could see it clearly enough to know for certain. Lights on the horizon, when they finally appeared, had to be studied and debated before anyone in the boats felt confident enough to call them a ship rather than another false promise. Some boats spotted the approaching vessel earlier than others, simply by virtue of where the drift and the rowing had carried them, and this unevenness meant the boats did not experience rescue as one shared event, but as a series of separate, staggered discoveries, each boat's crew and passengers reaching that moment of certainty in their own time. Later inquiry testimony indicates that survivors remained in their boats until roughly 5:30 in the morning, a span of hours that stretched the waiting long past the point where the ship's disappearance had first left them alone on the water. During that stretch, boats on the starboard side of the original sinking reportedly reached the rescue ship earlier than several boats that had launched from the port side, meaning the night ended for different people at meaningfully different times, even though all of them had shared the same ship only hours before. This is not a detail that resolves neatly into a single closing image. It simply confirms that the last phase of that night was, for nearly everyone involved, a matter of enduring drift and uncertainty rather than a moment of shared resolution. What the record does allow, without overstating what any one witness could actually see, is this: the ship was gone by around 2:20. The boats scattered afterward rather than holding together. The cold hours that followed were marked by false signs and real ones mixed together in memory, and rescue arrived unevenly, boat by boat, as the sky above the North Atlantic slowly, and without any single dramatic moment to mark the change, began to lighten toward morning. The night that had begun with dinner service and orchestra music, with stewards moving unseen through pantries and corridors, with wireless operators logging routine messages about ice somewhere ahead, closed instead in scattered boats upon dark water, each one carrying its own fragment of what had happened, waiting together and apart for whatever light the morning would finally bring.